Hello, and welcome to Who Gets to Be Violent, an exploration of gender and race in media. My name's James Foord, and today we're exploring how violence in media is framed differently depending on gender and race. We'll be looking at why we might react differently to male versus female violence in shows like The Punisher and Jessica Jones, and in games like The Last of Us and Tomb Raider. We'll also discuss the sacrifice of justified anger in black violence within Luke Cage. Joining me is Lucy Kirchmova, a third-year illustration student from UAL, who just completed a dissertation exploring unlikable female characters in video games. Before we get into it, would you like to talk about why this topic interests you?
Hi James, happy to be here. This topic interests me because I grew up loving video games and noticing the casual sexism that appeared within the community. And as a young child, you internalize a lot of what you see, and it's quite interesting looking back at how that morphed my perception of video games today and of the roles of women in video games, especially once they've gone past its basic stage and further developed in different genres.
Exactly. We as people and as young children internalize topics at those ages. For me, this topic is important, not just a fan of these stories, but as an animator who will be creating them in the future. I want to tell stories like the ones I grew up with, but I also recognize the importance of understanding the biases that might shape the way I portray violence. Even though I belong to a privileged demographic as a white cisgender man, my perspective as a queer person has made me more aware of the archetypes that shape masculinity in media, and I think that's influenced the way I engage with violent storytelling. Violence plays a major role in storytelling, whether it's pushing the plot forward, defining characters, or serving as pure spectacle. But the way that violence is framed and received isn't always equal. Gender and race play a role in shaping who is allowed to be violent, how justified that violence is, and how audiences react to it. Take The Punisher, for example. Frank Castle is a white male protagonist whose violence is driven by vengeance. He is framed as justified, and his character is often played as sympathetic due to the loss of his wife and child. His violence is direct, emotional, and cathartic, and the show never really asks us to question whether his rage is appropriate. It just is. His status as a white man allows his anger to be seen as righteous rather than dangerous. Compare that to Jessica Jones. Jessica is also driven by her past trauma. She's a rape survivor who was mind-controlled by the villain Kilgrave and forced into violent and sexual acts. That trauma looms over her, just like the loss of Frank's family looms over him. But unlike Frank, Jessica's moments of violence aren't celebrated in the same way. Instead of being empowering or cathartic, they often serve to remind us of her vulnerability. Now let's turn to Luke Cage. While the Punisher's violence is brutal and emotionally charged, Luke's is far more controlled. As Harlem's hero, Luke is expected to represent restraint and moral clarity, which mirrors real-world expectations placed on black men. His violence isn't just restricted by his superpowers, but also by societal pressures that demand he doesn't express his rage. Meanwhile, Frank is allowed to act on his anger freely, and that anger is rarely questioned. This isn't to say that Luke or Jessica are directly criticized for their violence, but rather that their stories mute or frame it within a narrative that demands more self-restraint. Why do you think that is?
There's definitely a big difference on how the general public views violence and anger being portrayed by a woman and a person of color than by their white male counterpart. This is very apparent in The Last of Us series. For instance, in the first game, we play as Joel, who's this very manly, very violent and angry man who murders and steals, and he's ruthless, but that's why the audience loves him. He's a complex character who has many flaws, but at the same time, they view him through the lens of protagonist bias. They see him as the good guy despite his bad actions. Then comes The Last of Us 2. We meet Abby. She is quite literally the mirror of Joel's character. Not only does she resemble his physique, she is seeking revenge through murder. By murdering Joel, she shows the audience just how vengeful and unethical her behavior is. However, unsurprisingly, the public was not very happy with her actions. Of course, putting aside the game's questionable pacing and questionable choices, of killing the lovable main character of the series 20 minutes into the second game, we have to see just how much her gender actually impacts the people's reaction to her anger. She is Joel's mirror image. In her work, Bogutskaya speaks about this phenomenon very well. She says media doesn't quite know how to handle angry women, because men are allowed to be angry. They're allowed to be vicious and unethical and still remain the attractive masculine lead. However, when you suddenly have a female character who has very masculine traits, the media doesn't know what to do with her because she's theoretically unprofitable. So into play comes the player's gender bias on how they perceive a woman and a man in positions of physical power. And we can compare that to the way the public views the Punisher and Jessica Jones and how their anger is portrayed in their respective TV shows.
Yeah, that's an interesting observation. It's not just about how necessarily these characters are portrayed, but also how they're perceived. We can try and say that Frank Castle and Jessica Jones and Luke Cage are all perceived differently because of interference from white male straight studio execs, or we could also look at the fact that each of these characters have their own interpretations with each and every person that watches the show. Another thing to consider is audience expectation. There's an ingrained belief that male characters can be violent without it being questioned, whereas women and black characters have to earn their violence through additional justifications. I think this plays into how Ellie and Joel's violence is treated differently in The Last of Us. Lucy, would you like to talk about that?
Definitely. I think the main way that Ellie and Joel's characters are treated differently when it comes to their playstyle is that in the second game, Ellie's playstyle is very stealth-based. She has a bow and she's not necessarily the best at hand-to-hand combat. You really want to be sneaky with her and creep up on your opponents, whereas in the first game, Joel, despite also not having the modern technology of the second game, the prone abilities, Joel is a tank, technically. He kind of mirrors Abby's character in that again, where he's a very muscular man who faces danger and violence head on. He doesn't stand back like Ellie to shoot his bow. He will meet like eye to eye with his enemies. Therefore, there is once again that sort of stigmatized ideal that Ellie is allowed to be violent and murderous, but it has to be with grace, delicate, lightweight. It cannot be head on, which is also probably one of the reasons why the audience generally disliked Abby's character, because it went against that grain, it's very similar to Tomb Raider as well in Lara Croft, where her anger and her violence is, again, okay because she does it in a dainty, feminine way, unlike Joel and Abby.
With these discussions of violence, it's also important to talk about our lived experiences. As an animator, I can look at this both as a consumer and as someone who might one day create these stories. I've grown up with a lot of violent media and I've seen how audience expectations shape what we think is acceptable. Even though I have the privilege of being a white man, my perspective as a queer person has made me more aware of the expectations placed on masculinity and how those expectations might affect my own work. In recent years, animated shows have become the go-to medium for hyper-violent, gory storytelling. Maybe this is because CGI is expensive or because animation allows for a kind of detachment that makes violence more palatable. Either way, the trend is undeniable. I've personally seen people complain online that certain media isn't violent enough, questioning why we aren't pushing animation further in terms of blood and gore. It's great that animation is being used to tell adult stories, but there's a fine line between artistic expression and excess. If hyperviolence becomes an expectation rather than a choice, we risk creating an unhealthy space for animators and storytellers. What do you think, Lucy? Do you think we're heading toward a saturation point with violence in animation and video games and other media?
Yes, I definitely do feel like today's media is very much based on violence. This was very prominent even in my childhood years. I still remember being slightly traumatized by Happy Tree Friends when someone in school put it up on the big screen. It's definitely, in my opinion, quite freakishly normalized, I don't think necessarily a lot of this violence should be so easily accessible, especially to young viewers and especially to young people being brought up in a heavily digital generation.
This conversation has really made me think about the way violence is framed and who gets to be violent. Before researching this, I knew that media treated male and female violence differently, but I hadn't thought as much about how race played into it or how industry expectations shape audience perception. Thanks for joining me, and thank you to everyone listening to Who Gets to Be Violent. I hope this discussion has given you something to think about. See you all next time.
Bye!